You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Please join us at the Open Door. We discuss solidarity, subsidiarity, economic democracy, and nonviolence in light of Catholic social teaching. We explore how to move from discussion to political change. Culture and politics, to be sure, are interwoven, so we care deeply about education and the arts. Our questions often lead us to report on the projects and promise of the American Solidarity Party.
Welcome to the Open Door. Jim Hannick here with fellow panelists Valerie Niemeyer and Christopher Zender. Today, we'll be talking about the Catholic Traditionalist movement. Our special focus will be independent traditionalists. How do they differ from other traditionalists? What leads them to LeFebvreism? And what can we all learn from the ongoing debate about the movement's role in the Church? Our welcome guest is Andrew Mioni. He is a graduate of Kansas State University with a BA in English. As a contributor to Faith in Crisis, and that's from Wipf and Stock this year, Andrew explores the roots of what many see as a crisis of faith in Catholicism. Andrew is the author of Altar Against Altar, an Analysis of Catholic Traditionalism. And that comes from En route Books in 2024, which is still the year we are in. Andrew, do you have the book to hold up for us?
I do. Here is a copy of the book.
All right.
Yes.
Very good. Very good. Well, as always, let's begin in prayer. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful and kindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and you shall renew the face of the earth. O God, who have taught the hearts of the faithful by the light of the Holy Spirit, grant that in the same Spirit we may be truly wise and ever rejoice in his consolation. Through Christ our Lord. Amen. To clarify matters, Andrew, we've got some acronyms and initials coming up here. What is the difference between the SSPX, the Society of St. Pius X, initiated by Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, and the FSSP, the Fraternal Society of St. Peter?
Right. So the SSPX and the FSSP both kind of come from the same origin. The FSSP originally, I should take it back. It all began with the SSPX when they set up an independent ministry in the 70s, 80s, following the Second Vatican Council. And after the consecrations, the four consecrations in 1988 by Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, who led the SSPX, a group of priests, I believe it was 12 priests, approached the Vatican and said, we're no longer willing to operate under our own standards, under our own banner. We want to be reconciled to the Church because we understand that the penalties that have been administered, I guess you could say, or the penalties that have been leveled on the SSPX after the consecrations was kind of the last straw for them. And they said, we'd like to continue our ministry as we are doing it, but with the approval of the Vatican. So those 12 priests were reconciled to the Church, and they formed what is now the Fraternity of St. Peter. So the SSPX operates independently without any delegated mission, while the FSSP offers the same Mass, the same sacraments, but does it with the approval of all the local bishops. They will not enter a diocese unless the local bishop gives them approval, whereas the SSPX will kind of has what they see as free reign, I guess you could say. So yeah, they both began in the immediate aftermath of the council, and the FSSP is sort of a splinter group of them, but that came back to the church.
A promising splinter, though.
Indeed.
All right. Valerie, your question.
Well, the word ideology is thrown around a lot, and some people would use it in relation to, for instance, groups who would call themselves traditionalists, including both maybe of those that you had kind of defined for us. How do you understand the word ideology, which we all use or hear so often?
Mm-hmm. Ideology, I think, is a conglomeration of ideas, a conglomeration of motivating, motivating factors, I guess you could say, that maybe is not defined on paper so much as it is understood in practice, I guess. So these various groups, these various traditionalist groups, some of them may be canonically legitimate. Some of them may be, on paper, everything is acceptable, but their adherents still may hold to a problematic ideology. It's unpredictable. You can't really pin it down in one group or another. I would say there are some, primarily the independent ones, who are led by a specific ideology, and then that can bleed into the other groups as well. It can affect other individual members as well. So I think the best example of it would be, adherents to, maybe in the Fraternity of St. Peter, can also have some ideas that the adherents in the SSPX hold. The two groups are very different when it comes to, the legal side, the canonical side, but the ideas, the outlook on the church, if you will, can kind of blur lines between the two. I think that would be the easiest way to define it.
Okay. So could you say that there's like an ideology might be a way of viewing with a certain lens, a certain hierarchy of values, or a certain, is that a way you could describe it maybe?
I think so. Yeah. It's seeing things through a certain perspective, or with a certain bias is maybe too strong of a word to use here, but seeing things, or seeing teachings, declarations of the church, etc., with a certain angle, maybe with a certain preconceived outlook on things, and one that can't be, like I said, necessarily pinned to a specific group or a specific movement, but that is influenced by a group or by a collective of ideas.
Okay.
Let me add a couple points on the term ideology. Sometimes it just refers to any coherent set of beliefs. And then it's a very neutral term. But there's a mainstream of thinking about ideology that's very well recognized, that treats an ideology as any kind of intellectual apparatus used to defend some sort of power consolidation. And in politics, oftentimes that's the way the word ideology is used. But again, sometimes it's used in a very neutral sense. We're members of the American Solidarity Party, and from time to time, someone in the party will refer to our ideology. And I always correct them, time permitting, to say that, well, we don't have an ideology in the sense that we have some sort of artificial intellectual construction to defend our power position. Various reasons we don't have a power position to defend. Another reason is we're basically rooted in Christian social thinking, and I would never refer to that as an ideology, although just about any columnist writing for the New York Times would say that we have an ideology. So ideology is sometimes used as a boo word. And it's hard to keep all of these strands separate. Christopher.
Yeah, I'm particularly interested in historical questions in terms of traditionalism, because traditionalists, they see themselves as rooted in tradition, which is, of course, historical. But you say that that to be deep in history is to cease to be a traditionalist. Why is that?
Sure. So that's a phrase that my wife coined when we were doing our research. And for some backstory, my wife was raised in the SSPX. I was raised in the FSSP. And then collectively, we were trying to figure out a way forward, trying to figure out the best way forward, because those two groups obviously clash on certain things. And we said, if we're going to be raising a family and we have to be on the same spiritual page, for lack of a better term, we have to agree on these things. These are very important things. And so we delved a lot into early church fathers. We delved a lot into scripture. We delved a lot into the roots of the church, if you will. And I remember, I think it was Bible in a Year with Father Mike Schmitz was where we really started to see things from a different perspective, especially in reading Leviticus and reading about Old Testament sacrifice and seeing the connections with with the Mass today. And then reading early church fathers and how they understood the church, how they understood what divisions in the church really were, reading about early liturgies and reading about how we have gone from, the descriptions of St. Justin Martyr of the early liturgies to our Mass today. And getting back to the heart of it, getting back to the roots of it was really what changed our minds on all these things, and all the talking points and all the things that we've been told growing up that really did not hold up to scrutiny when we started doing a historical deep dive. And that's when we started to see and understand why the church had made certain changes, why the church had issued certain declarations, for example, through the Second Vatican Council, why it was that we had the Second Vatican Council at all these things, kind of the broad historical perspective, looking at it over the course of 2,000 years and not just over the last 50 years or so, seeing how it all came together and how it all influenced itself, and just seeing the big picture and seeing how God is in charge and God has guided it through all of the turmoil of of its entire history. And we realized that the traditionalist position, and I'll define that term shortly, because I know there's going to be some questions on how I use it here, but the traditionalist position we felt was did not exactly compute with the direction the church was going, what the church had said, what the church was trying to do. And while we very much appreciated our, the Latin Mass that we went to, while we very much appreciated our community, we appreciated the good, solid values that we have been raised with. I'm always grateful for those. And I think my parents and my teachers did a great job. But as a whole, as a compass for our life, if you will, we said we need to be thinking with the church here. And while the church has been very gracious in allowing, certain aspects like the Latin Mass or these, the Fraternity of St. Peter and all these things to continue, is that a trajectory that we want to take ourselves and our children on? And so kind of connecting it back to our talk on ideology, and with the different groups, the fraternity and the SSPX at play here, I'll just give a little bit of a definition on what I mean by traditionalism here, and what my wife was referring to when she said that quote, coining or rephrasing St. John Henry Newman. So the subtitle of this book is An Analysis of Catholic Traditionalism. And I know some people, some people understand that term to be sort of a broad umbrella term to encompass all of the various groups and the various movements who have certain common denominators, like the Latin Mass and like certain, their communities and all these things. The way I understand traditionalism, and I have a whole explanation in the book on this, is I see it as its own ism, if you will, as its own thing. And I think when the movement started after the Second Vatican Council, those who were calling themselves traditionalists, or those who were calling themselves traditional Catholics, were the ones who were trying to distinguish themselves in some way or another. They were trying to give some differentiation of, we are not them. We are not the Catholics who follow the council, right? And I think those who then were reconciled to the church, like the fraternity, even though they still said the same mass and offered the same sacraments and such, I personally, this is just my opinion, I don't think it is necessary or appropriate to label oneself a traditionalist. If you happen to just enjoy Latin Mass, or if you happen to just prefer older devotions or anything like that. I'll read off a quote that I put in the book to explain my definition here. This is from Pope Benedict XV. And obviously the context is a little bit different, but I think the applicability is the same. He wrote, quote, "Catholics should abstain from certain appellations which have recently been brought into use to distinguish one group of Catholics from another. There is no need of adding any qualifying terms to the profession of Catholicism. It is quite enough for each one to proclaim, 'Christian is my name and Catholic my surname.' Only let him endeavor to be in reality what he calls himself," end quote. That's from Ad Beatissimi Apostolorum in 1914. So I think there's no need to add any qualifiers to your faith. If you are Catholic, you are Catholic. And to call yourself, if you're in the fraternity, for example, and you call yourself a traditional Catholic, to me, that implies that those who are not in that same group are not traditional Catholic. And that I kind of have I kind of take issue with. So traditionalism, as I refer to it here in this book, is specifically about independent traditionalist groups. They're about groups who don't operate with any delegated jurisdiction, who don't operate with the approval of the local bishop, who don't have any canonical mission. And the issues that I explore in this book about, for example, they cite a state of necessity as a justification for their ministry. They cite that they have supply jurisdiction as a basis for their ministry. All these things, these do not apply to canonically regular traditional quote groups, if you will. So just want to add that clarifier, because I know that's a question that people have had. It's a question that when I've stated that in previous interviews, people have said, thank you for the clarification, because that term is thrown out a lot, and a lot of different people have a lot of different understandings of what it means. So I just want to add that. But yeah, to take it back to your original question about to be deep in history is to cease to be traditionalist. I know, for example, reading the letters of St. Ignatius of Antioch from the first century, and he is repeatedly stating throughout all of his epistles that the church is nothing without the bishop. The church cannot function. You cannot function without the bishop. You cannot do anything without the approval of the bishop. And we said, well, if he was saying this all the way back in the earliest days of the church in the first century, what's the justification for doing that now? And if the church, the church was undeniably in a much worse state then in his time than it is now. The church was under persecution. The church was, they were trying to stamp it out. And now when we're established worldwide and we have dioceses, we have bishops, we have priests, and we're allowed to practice those two. That's just, I think, one example of us coming across historical context and historical information that we said this doesn't match up with what we've been told and how the groups that we were in have been operating. And so many other such examples like that of historical context, of ecclesiological context, really opened up our eyes to the broader perspective there and helped us to see that, these things that we've been told just regarding the last 50 years or the things that we've been told about the liturgy, or the things that we've been told about apostolic authority, all these things just didn't quite line up. So that was, I think, the conclusion that my wife reached after lots of research was reading history and getting a broader perspective on everything will really change your mind. It wasn't that we found some really clever canonical argument that finally disproved what she'd been told, or we found some quotes that maybe we hadn't heard before. It was a lot of prayer and research and study, and I mean, coupled with going to adoration and and all these things, it was a whole conglomeration of things. But yeah, gaining that wider historical perspective was very crucial.
It's interesting when you talk about history, because, well, of course, one of the claims is that you can't just suppress traditional rights. That somehow a traditional right has a kind of canonical status, which makes it inviolate. But I've been plowing through recently Jungmann's History of the Roman Rite, and just talk about how Charlemagne, with Rome's approval, suppressed the Gallican rights in France. And then you have Pope Gregory VII, who suppressed the Mozarabic rite. The Fourth Lateran Council came out and said, basically, they would, if it was union with the East again, they would allow them to maintain their religious rights, as if they could actually suppress those too. So I'm not proposing that the church should frequently do this sort of thing. It's just that the church seems to say she has the power to do it. She has the authority to do it. Mm-hmm. And the claim is now that no, she doesn't. The Pope cannot do anything like that. So any suppression of the traditional Mass, and I find this even outside of SSPX circles, would allow for just disobedience on the part of bishops and the part of even priests.
Right, and that's definitely a topic that has reared its head lately, with rumors swirling of a coming suppression, and yeah, you'll frequently hear things cited like Quo Primum, which was Pope Pius V's apostolic constitution to codify the Roman Missal. I like to point out to people that if the entire church, every bishop except 4 bishops voted in the affirmative on Sacrosanctum Concilium at the Second Vatican Council, if the entire church agreed the liturgy needs a reform, and then after the reform, some people did not care for it and tried looking for reasons as to why they didn't have to accept the Reformed Missal and why we really couldn't change the Missal in the first place. Again, historically, does not seem to match up, because if everyone agrees this needs to happen, and then you only go looking for loopholes as to why you don't have to accept it after you don't like the results, I find that to be an inconsistent argument.
I'd like to introduce a discussion of another term. But before that, I have a peculiar question. Our absent colleague, Mario Ramos Reyes, like you, is from Kansas. And then, of course, there's that whole Wizard of Oz development that had its origin in Kansas. And every traditionalist of every stripe knows about Father Finn. Mm-hmm. And yep. Father Finn was in Kansas. Andrew, why Kansas? Why? It's bad enough that we have to talk about Ohio. It's bad enough that we have to talk about Nebraska. We meet. Even without an introduction to Warren Buffett, we have to still talk about Nebraska. But why Kansas?
I think it's purely a functional thing. I think it's just because Kansas is the exact center of the U.S. I know the exact geographic center of the U.S. is in northern Kansas, and I know that was the reason Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre cited when they bought the property in St. Mary's, Kansas, as he says it's right in the center, and it's easiest for commutes, for people to come, for growth, all these kinds of things. And then, with that being the SSPX's primary hub and all these other splinter groups forming over the last several decades, they've all kind of set up around that. So the fraternity has also sprung up in Maple Hill, Kansas, about 10 minutes away. There's the resistance group up in Bellevue, Kansas, I believe it is. There's, there are a couple more groups in Kansas City. I think it's just with that starting as its primary hub, and then the different groups breaking off and forming their own communities, their own establishments around that area. It's all just kind of clustered there. So, yeah.
Now, is it true that the Archbishop was the first to say, location, location, location? Perhaps that's apocryphal. Could you tell us about the sede vacantists?
Certainly. So sede vacantist comes from the Latin sede vacante, which means empty chair or empty seat. Sede vacantists are another branch of traditionalists who believe, as the name indicates, that the seat or the throne of Peter, the seat of Peter, is empty. That since 1958, when Pope Pius XII died, every pope since then has been a heretic, an anti-pope, therefore has never held the position of the papacy at all. So essentially, they believe that we are leaderless as of right now. We have no pope. We have not had a pope since 1958. And there are really no indications as to when or how a new pope will take office. They believe that the Second Vatican Council is kind of the precursor to the last days, if you will, the great, as they say, the great apostasy in the church, as various prophecies from private revelations, whether approved or not, might indicate. And so they are, I guess, just patiently waiting it out to see what happens and how it happens. And whenever Christ will come back, I think some of them believe that we are in the days immediately leading up to the second coming. Others think that there will be a pope appointed, but it will be through some miraculous divine intervention. Some just speculate and say, we don't know how a new pope will come, but a new pope will, which this book poses the question, okay, when and how? Because if there's no pope, and then someone takes office and one set of vacantist group says, yes, that is now the pope, but another set of vacantist group says, no, we don't accept him as pope. Well, okay, is he or isn't he? It's kind of a dead end when it comes to the future, I guess, or future outlook. They found an easy route to reject the council and the popes and all these developments that they see as problematic, but then there's not really a way out of it. So that's kind of the other side of the coin of the traditionalist, as I describe it, movement. There's the sede vacantists, and then there's what's called the recognize and resist, primarily led by the SSPX, who believe that the council and all these things are, strictly speaking, legitimate. Strictly speaking, they're valid, but they are so problematic that we have to reject them. Whereas a sede vacantists just say they're not even valid, they're not even legitimate. They believe that the new rite of ordination that was promulgated after the council is invalid. They believe that the Novus Ordo Missae is invalid. They believe that there's only probably a small handful, maybe a couple dozen, couple hundred valid and legitimate priests in the entire world. You have such groups as Most Holy Family Monastery, which is led by the Diamond Brothers up in upstate New York, where I live, who, yeah, they I haven't delved into their stuff much because it's quite the rabbit hole, but yeah, they essentially believe that any bishop, priest, cardinal, etc., ordained after 1958 is not, in fact, a priest, and that we are down to the bottom of the barrel. We're scraping the bottom of the barrel when it comes to actual pastors of souls.
Pretty grim.
Can I assume that it's a pretty small minority, even of independent traditionalists, that would take that stance of sedevacantism?
It's fairly small. The recognize and resist is definitely the larger group. Sedevacantists are very fringe, but they are, I wouldn't consider them small necessarily. They do tend to pop up wherever the traditionalist hubs are located. So I know there are some in Kansas, there are some in around the Cincinnati area is where a lot of traditionalist groups tend to be. Upstate New York, the Spokane area, there's in Oregon, Nebraska. for example, the CMRI, or the Congregation of Mary Immaculate Queen, I think is probably the biggest sedevacantist group. And I would say when it comes to communities, there's probably going to be one at every centralization of traditionalist groups, but their communities tend to be very small. But they are definitely present, and they definitely have, they definitely have influence, as we've seen with the latest developments with Archbishop Vigano. You know, it's a small group, but it's influential enough that it reaches the top tiers of the hierarchy. It influences some very influential people. So their numbers may be small, but they are very vocal, especially on the internet.
Interesting. I'm in Omaha. We do have one, probably about 3 minutes. Parish with about 3 minutes from us. George Weigel is a name we hear a lot. A John Paul II scholar, a frequent contributor to First Things. Apparently, he's kind of helped you along the journey. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So my introduction to George Weigel, and I've since delved into a little bit more of his online writings, not so much more of his books, but he came out with a book, I believe it was 2 years ago, and the book is called To Sanctify the World. The subtitle is The Vital Legacy of Vatican II. And this was another resource that really helped us to see the broader historical perspective of this whole movement, because this book, as he explains, he said that the questions have been unanswered for too long of why was Vatican II called, what did it intend to do, and what do we need to learn from it? And he wanted to present a very readable, very open, very clear answer to these questions. And about the first third of this book, about the first 100 pages or so, is just the global historical perspective of the world, what the world was doing, how it was developing, what was happening, that brought us to the position where Pope St. John the 23rd decided we need a council to address this. And what George Weigel concludes is that this crisis in the church that the traditionalists always cite, and that is most certainly present, I'm not denying it at all. I think the real cause, as I'll explain, is quite different from what the traditionalists conclude. But what George Weigel concludes is that this crisis in the church has been developing for quite some time, for about 150 years. And in my book, I trace it back, the roots of it at least even further than that. But he says it was really building since about the mid 1800s. And then what really kickstarted it was World War I. This global conflict with the means and the weapons and the ramifications that we had never faced before, that brought death and destruction and all these horrible things in the world that we had never had to face before. And he sees that as the real starting point of this crisis of supernatural faith, this critical loss of supernatural faith in the world. And he has an insight that I thought was very helpful, where he said, you'll frequently see people citing, evidence, photos, testimonies, anecdotes, etc., from like 1940s, 1950s America, where it looks like the faith is booming. There's all these people with huge families. They're dressed well. They're going to mass. There's all these regal ceremonies and all this stuff. And what George Weigel says is that the 1950s or so Catholicism in America, I believe he describes it as the last gasp of a dying Christendom, because he said this massive implosion of faith was already happening in Europe, in the heart of Christianity. It hadn't made its way to America because America hadn't seen war on its own soil. It hadn't directly seen what World War I, World War II, all these horrors and atrocities of the wars and what it does to people's faith. Americans hadn't seen that. Obviously, American soldiers had, but Americans in everyday life had not seen that. They hadn't seen what these massively impactful events could do to supernatural faith. They were just carrying on as usual. But as Pope Benedict XVI would go on to write in the late 1950s, that he saw American Catholicism, not so much American, but the faith in general in that time, immediately preceding the council, as kind of an external layer or a facade of going through the motions, fulfilling the obligations, presenting a nice external image of faith, but at its heart, something was wrong. At its heart, we were not actually living out the faith. We were not actually motivated by faith. We were just carrying out the motions that previous generations had done and that we've been taught to do. And that, I found, is reflected by a lot of writings of popes of previous centuries. I'll find one quote in the book here that it just floored me when I came across this. This is from Pope Pius XI in 1937, so long before before the council. He said in Divini Redemptoris, 1937, he said, quote, "Even in Catholic countries, there are still too many who are Catholics hardly more than in name. There are too many who fulfill more or less faithfully the more essential obligations of the religion they boast of professing, but have no desire of knowing it better, of deepening their inward conviction, and still less of bringing it into conformity with the external gloss, the inner splendor of a right and unsullied conscience that recognizes and performs all its duties under the eye of God. We know how much our divine Savior detested this empty Pharisaic show, he who wished that all should adore the Father in spirit and in truth," end quote. So I found that insight from George Weigel to be backed up, to be reflected by the writings of the popes in the late 19th, early 20th century. They were saying the faith it's still present, but it's more external than actually lived. And I think when you have, as George Weigel described, these huge global movements like the wars and the technological advancements of the 40s, 50s, 60s, all these things that presented a challenge to supernatural faith that the church had never dealt with before. We had to come up with some response to that and say, we can't just continue. We can't just go on as we've been doing. There has to be something to rekindle the faith in people who may be doing the things that they were told to do, but they don't actually know their faith. George Weigel really presented a good case there that, as I then did more research, it was really backed up by the writings of the popes of previous centuries and by all the historical evidence. It all seemed to corroborate. So he was, the one who started my historical deep dive and who presented a case that I think is very solid.
It's interesting. My father-in-law was born in, probably 1938 or so. And I remember him saying, he had like 3 aunts that were, they were German immigrants, his family, but he had like 3 aunts that went into the convent. And he has said, on multiple occasions that he often felt like that their vocations were, as much as anything, just a path to get a square meal. And, a relatively good living situation in a world where eking out a living on the land with a family was a pretty daunting landscape, and that in a sense that that they were able to take refuge. And I don't say that in a condescending way. It's not to question their devotion or anything of the sort, but it just demonstrates that there are other factors at play when things seem to be, vocations are booming or whatever. It's not always that simple.
Right. I've heard also that similarly that there were priests who would join the seminary because it means they didn't have to go off to war. They were, as you say, guaranteed a relatively stable living situation and wouldn't have to risk their lives. And this was an easy way to get out of it. So maybe some of that boom in vocations in the 30s, 40s, et cetera, from priests might have just been priests who were trying to avoid. I don't know. I'm just speculating, but it certainly, as a proposition, seems to be somewhat plausible. So that's an interesting insight.
Yeah, and the cultural kind of expectancy of, like, in some cultures where like every family gives a child to the religious life, gives a child to the boy who's the most pious is going to be the boy, who's going to be we're going to give to the church as a priest. And
right.
There's stories about people who sort of, that path was laid out for them and didn't feel that they were maybe free to pursue something else. Mm-hmm. The church would dishonor their parents to not pursue this.
Right.
And despite the fact that their piety was real and authentic. So.
Right. Right. Yep. We were told growing up always that 1 out of every 3 boys has a vocation. I believe that was something that St. John Bosco said or something. I don't quite remember, but yeah, and there were 4 boys in my family, and my parents would always say, one of you has a vocation. Well, none of us have yet. So it's a nice thing to say, but you can't force anyone's vocation. And if that's not what they're called to, then it's not what they're called to. Again, I'm not, calling into question anyone's vocation or implying that anyone had ulterior motives. But yeah, when you examine the broader perspective of what the world was like at that time and things that might have motivated someone to say, where can I find some kind of stability? It's, I think an entirely plausible factor.
Mm-hmm.
Christopher.
Yeah.
Doesn't he look thoughtful? Doesn't he look thoughtful?
Yes, I've always looked thoughtful. I'm just tired. No. When you talk about the historical background and that the church needed to adjust the way she interacted with the world, I think that's probably what you're saying. Because of the vast change that occurred, particularly in the 20th century, but even earlier than that. That's to assert that the church had to do that is not to say that the way the church actually did it was always happy. So I'm wondering, would you consider that maybe the traditionalists have a point in some of their criticisms? I mean, that we seem to have entered an age after the council where there was almost like a wholesale rejection of everything that come before. It's always to make all things new. I'm not saying that was what the popes were saying, but that seemed to be the spirit, as it were, coming out of the council. So I mean, the traditionalists have a point that we do have to reaccess our tradition, and if so, how do we do that?
Yeah, I would certainly agree. I certainly think that, as my wife and I call it, the pendulum swing after the council, it swung in both directions. And I think, the traditionalists definitely have a point that, I wasn't alive in the 70s and 80s, so I don't know about all the liturgical craziness aside from stories I've been told. But I can pretty well assume that if I were in that time and I was, I were attending these masses, and I would say, even if the council didn't call for this or outright didn't approve it, how in the world did we get here? And I want to go to that Latin mass down the street, right? So I think they definitely have good intentions, and I think they definitely present a good, legitimate complaints. I just think that as the book just talks about, that I don't think that justifies setting up an independent ministry to combat it. You have to stay within the church to be able to do that properly. So I think a restoration of traditional values, such as what maybe the fraternity is doing, the Institute of Christ the King, or even a Latin Mass is offered in the dioceses. And I think there's very good influence of restoring older practices, restoring older devotions, restoring more spiritual rigor that they definitely have had a good influence on. They present legitimate concerns. I just think that there is a way to address those concerns without taking yourself outside of full communion with the church. And that's, I think, the happy medium that we have to find, is that, the church is neither right nor left. It's my wife and I like to say it's neither right nor left. It's above both of those. It's not center, it's above. And so that's, I think, what we have to try to say, okay, the traditionalists don't go too far. Stay within the bosom of the church and have your influence there. And if you, for example, if you're dissatisfied with the way your local parish is doing liturgy, the way to fix that is not to go off and set up your own church and huddle over there. The way to do that is to approach your pastor and say, hey, we have some concerns. We would really like to rectify this somehow. Or, if people are maybe not dressing well for Mass and you have issue with that, well, then go to Mass and dress better and set a good example. There are ways to do it from within. There are ways to do it properly without removing yourself from the equation and saying, we'll just be satisfied with what we have over here in our corner, and we'll just wait for the church to kind of figure it out. I think the influence needs to be from within, not removing oneself and waiting for things to shake out the way you like them, and then rejoining once it's to your satisfaction, if that makes sense.
Yeah, but couldn't you say that? I mean, we've heard a lot about dialogue since the Second Vatican Council.
Sure.
We can say what the traditionalists should do, and I know I'm not a traditionalist, but we helped start a choir at a parish. We lived in California, and we seem to be building a little enclave of a traditional music mass, right? Until we got a new pastor, and everything changed. And I think that's what a lot of traditionalists would say. Until we got a new pastor, that everything was fine until of that. Is the church? I'm thinking particularly Pope Francis, who's I think his record on this has been very mixed. Is the church really dialogued with the traditionalists well enough? I mean, really, has there been a real attempt to really speak to them and to address the concerns?
I am a little bit torn on this question, because on the one hand, I would say probably not. Probably no, they haven't. We see a lot of comments. I don't want to say accusations, but a lot of things leveled toward the traditionalists that, they often say, why weren't we consulted? Why weren't we talked to? Why weren't we allowed to voice our concerns about this? Or why weren't we allowed to voice our opinions about this before something was leveled our way? So on the one hand, I get it. On the other hand, there are such gestures as Pope Francis granting SSPX priests jurisdiction to absolve sins, which is so canonically irregular. Even Cardinal Burke, who is an eminent canonist, said this is simply an anomaly, and we don't know there's no good canonical explanation for this. So on the one hand, they're given olive branches that just absolutely make no sense. But then on the other hand, yes, there are, I think, certain things leveled their way, certain declarations or whatnot that maybe are a little heavy-handed. I don't know. I have mixed feelings on that question.
It's a hard question to answer, because they're not. To be quite honest with you, be blunt, traditionalists can be very obnoxious, and so it's not like they're dialoguing with anybody either. Of course, they're not into dialogue, but they can be very obnoxious too. So you could see how, I don't know, they could be instigating bad reactions to themselves.
Well, I think a good example is after Traditionis Custodes was issued in 2021, which brought the permissions for the Latin Mass back in the hands of the bishops. Right off the bat, and to their credit, there were a couple of traditionalist voices saying, okay, this is an opportunity for us to show that we are obedient, humble, docile, we obey the church, we listen to the church, all these things, and we should not explode about this. We should not have a violent reaction, and show that we are not deserving of these kinds of sanctions, if you will. But naturally, that's what happened. Everybody got furious. The internet exploded. There was this huge outcry. There were petitions. There were videos. There were all these things. And some of them, pretty nasty. So as you say, I think for dialogue to go one way, it has to go the other way as well. And if they're not willing to approach and admit that maybe they have raised some problematic positions that the Vatican has to address, it's a two-way street. Ultimately, I would agree that there needs to be some more conversation, some more reaching out to them. But if they don't want to reach back out, that's kind of problematic. I'll cite maybe a case study of this in the book I talk about. There's a traditionalist group, an independent group in Colorado, who broke away from the SSPX. It's just a small group of about 7 priests. And the local bishop initially granted him faculties for private mass, for Latin Mass. This priest abused that faculty and went on to set up a public, a community, a church or whatever. And the bishop obviously did not approve that. He went and he contacted them. He tried to sit down with them. He got a conversation with them. He said, I want to help you guys. I want to bring you back into the church. I want to address any issues. But then the priest just rejected his offer. He rejected his proposition to meet. He, as the bishop cited, he accused him of being a modernist and setting up a new religion and adhering to heretical ideas and all these things. And so the bishop said, hey, I tried to talk to you. You don't want to listen. So then he wrote his letter saying, okay, I strip you of your faculties. You are no longer in good standing with the church. And until we can have a conversation about this and you can be willing to work with me here, you don't have a ministry. And so, I think that's a good case study of a lot of times the reaction is it's just a wall. They just don't want to talk. Now, I'm not saying that's the case with every group or with every priest, obviously, but that's one I remember I cited in here when they're talking about sanctions or reprimands. I think that's a good question. A two-way street needs to be on both sides.
And again, we're talking here about independent traditionalists who are not, unlike the many, 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 many faithful Catholics who associate themselves with the FSSP and just want to see a more reverent liturgy and a more wholehearted, whole life Catholicism in their midst. You mentioned obnoxious, Christopher. And I think a lot of, what I hear, a lot of the complaint is as far as how the Vatican is handling, how Pope Francis is handling the discipline, or however you want to call his actions towards regarding the Latin Mass, is that, there are just so many obnoxious instances of irreverence in the Mass throughout the world, throughout the country, throughout where people are not giving the Mass its due in terms of reverence, in terms of what it is. And so I guess, what is your response to people who would say, okay, but this is just so unbalanced, like the heavy-handedness with which he's approaching, Latin Mass, people who were promoting that compared to those who are frankly just disregarding the need to promote faith in the real presence through a beautiful, reverent liturgy that speaks of the transcendence of God in our life.
Right. And I would agree again that, that's still definitely an issue and still needs to be addressed. I would say in my experience, the trend has definitely been upward in that regard. Things have gotten better. But you do raise a good question of a potential double standard, I guess. This is a tough question because I think in order to fix the problems on the other side, if you will, in order to promote, better liturgy, better understanding of it, in order to, how should I describe it? In order to help the church grow in that way, that really has to come from the bottom up. Whereas dealing with the traditionalists can only be a top-down approach, and I'll explain what that means. So, if we want better liturgy, if we want more reverence, if we want all these things, I don't think that decrees or that statements or that orders from Rome is going to do that. There was a document just recently. Within the last year, and the name is slipping my mind at the moment, but it was about this very question about how, the long and short of it was, hey, stop messing around in the liturgy, do the right things, don't bring in any nonsense or whatever. But a document or a declaration can only go so far. If people won't do it, then people won't do it. And I think that the people who take it to heart and the people who really care, those numbers are growing, and it's going to have a knock-on effect that I think in time will definitely blossom. But whereas on the other side with the traditionalists, it's kind of the same issue of like, how can you get them to drop the obnoxious ways and return to thinking with the mind of the church and whatnot? You really can't. So the only way to deal with it is to issue restrictions or issue disciplinary measures, I guess. The popes since that time, since the council, have all pretty consistently said, "Hey, we've gone too far on this liturgical stuff. We really need to rein this in. We really need to do all." I mean, if we've been saying this for like the last 50 years, and it's slowly gotten better, but dealing with the traditionalists on the other side, and you have to say, okay, you guys, you got to stop. You got to knock that off. You got to, you can't be saying these kinds of things. You can't be slandering the Pope like that. You can't be setting up independent ministries, all these things. That's more of just a top-down approach of dealing with it. So I think it's, those who would want a good liturgy, a good mass, a good community, those are great things, and you should want those. But coupling that with rejection of a council, or coupling that with disrespect toward the magisterium, or all these things, those two shouldn't and needn't go hand in hand. You should be able to just be grateful for what you've been given by the church, for them allowing this certain liturgy or whatever to continue, and then kind of finding that middle ground, if you will. I don't know if I answered the question super well, but that's kind of my thoughts on it.
So, and I think a lot of frustration comes from the fact that, like you said, people just aren't doing it in their eyes. The Pope said, it's kind of like a parent who says, "I don't agree with the choices you're making, but I'm still going to invite you to dinner."
Right.
I can talk about it constantly to you. You know how I feel about it. And in some ways, I think the Pope kind of takes that stance of, well, we've said what needs to be said with regard to being faithful to the rubrics, etc. I can't just run around constantly telling people to do it. So maybe that's perceived as a lack of, or an uneven-handedness, that he's not speaking it regularly. I don't know. But it's tricky. Jim, are you going to ask for an extension? I feel like we should. Such a weighty topic.
Well, I was going to say, and I still will, that we're at the end of the hour, but we need an extension. So peeps, if you're going to hang in for 5 or 10 minutes, we could go forward. And I certainly want to go forward, so I won't even ask if you want to go forward again. You had your chance. At this point in the show, as Valerie knows, I sometimes offer a pop quiz to bring everything into perspective. At other points, I raise what seem to be random reflections. And then after the random reflections are laid out there, somebody says, "Geez, that's something." Now, I get to do this in lieu of either a salary or a designated parking spot. I don't have either of those. And that's why I have this indulgence. So I'm going to eschew the pop quiz and go with the random reflections. And I think they go together. In terms of history and what we've seen and what we've suffered, and while there are new things under the sun, there might not be so many new things under the sun as we suppose. There's a famous sermon among the many famous sermons of St. John Chrysostom, where he says in a crowded church, and this is pretty much direct, he says, "I know that many of you are here for the races." Here we are in an urban center, right? The East. He says to the congregants, "I know that many of you are really here for the races, and they're pretty special. And you're thinking, how can you kill time? Well, this fellow has a reputation for being an eloquent speaker, so now that's why you're here sitting in front of me." Talk about veneer. Talk about mixed motives for participation. That's something that goes way, way back. Now, in terms of modernism and all the things that lead to modernism, and in terms of calamitous, horrible, horrific, almost unspeakable events, there's an area of the world today where there's a greater falling away from religious practice than Europe. It's East Asia. Buddhism is undergoing almost complete collapse. And that has nothing to do with any of the things that we Eurocentric people have in mind as decisive. It's crisis of faith. It's a crisis of religious belief, and it's affected Buddhism more than it has affected Catholicism. Now, in terms of not what you might think, but really important sources for vocations, we have Nigeria, all sorts of unrest. Really be nice to have a square meal. Really be nice to have some stability. Why don't you enter the seminary? It will also increase your chances for martyrdom. Nowhere are Catholics suffering greater persecution than Nigeria and Pakistan. But in Nigeria, it's very, very clear, very, very obvious. So in every age, the church does raise up martyrs. And the last point, this is a little bit out of sequence. I think George Weigel is a terrific writer. I think his politics are sorrowful. But he is a terrific writer. Too bad he's a miserable neocon, but at any rate, he's a terrific writer. And the business about Americans in World War I and the like, we lost a greater percentage of our people in the Civil War. And the Civil War split Christian denominations right down the middle. So to say that there's something unique about World War I think is, as they say, arguable, even for Americans. Well, those are some random reflections, and I think I'm going back to Christopher here. Once you dig deep into history, you soon enough learn that you haven't dug nearly deeply enough. There's a whole lot of history to dig through. But now those are the end of my random reflections, and I have no pop quiz to offer. So all of you are cordially invited to have a final thought or three, and then we'll end as we always need to do with the gospel for today.
I'll jump in on that, on your last point about, World War I and the historical context. And I think there is greater context that is needed because, isolated by itself, I would agree that World War I, World War II, early 20th century is, of course, we've dealt with war on a massive scale before. But as this book points out, talking about the crisis of faith and the greater historical context, I diagnose it as what I call a crisis of functionality, which I think is unique to 19th, 20th, especially 21st century. And this is something that Pope Benedict XVI writes about a lot, and I cite him quite a few times, where he says that he called it the great poverty of our age, that we only think in terms of function now. We don't raise our horizons beyond what is quantifiable, what we can harness, what we can use, what can bring us material gain. And this is something that is unique to the recent age, in that in the Civil War, 1800s, it was around the time, I think, when things were starting to turn around. But what really kicked this off was, the Industrial Revolution, the early 19th century with electricity, with making things, as again Pope Benedict XVI says, functional in the service of man. And I use this image a lot. I debated putting this image in the book, and I didn't, but I like to use the image of a really, really old church that was built in maybe late 1800s in the middle of a city block, right? And it's very ornate, and it's very the detail is very exquisite, and it was clearly made with care and with passion, and that the people were really motivated by this thing that they were doing. And since then, and this is the case with the church that I used to go to in Kansas City, there's this old church in the middle of a city, and it's absolutely dwarfed by parking garages, by skyscrapers, by office buildings, by apartment buildings. And I think that's a good visual for what has happened to the church since then, since that time of the late 19th century, is that it's just become small and insignificant among all this conglomeration of functional stuff, of business and of commerce and all these things, and on a scale that we haven't really dealt with before, on a scale that technological progress and advancement has brought us to that we've never dealt with before. And so, and this is something also that I cite in the 1950s, taking us back to the historical conversation. The Catholic historian Christopher Dawson describes a survey that was taken in the early 1950s when things were already starting to be on the decline, and people were saying the reason they don't practice any kind of religion, the reason they don't have any supernatural faith, is because it doesn't do anything for them. One person said, "It doesn't pay my bills. Why should I care?" One person said, "It makes demands on my spare time. Why should I care?" It's kid stuff. It's mythical. It's magical. It's not real. It's not. I can't put my finger on it. I can't quantify it. I can't measure it. Why should I care? And I think that's a situation in the context that we're in today, with the internet and instantaneous communication across the world, the consumerism, where you can buy something with a device at your fingertips and it can reach you within a day or two. Mass-produced goods and all the entertainment, the media, all these things that you could possibly want to just drown yourself in and distract yourself from pursuing something higher, from pursuing something beyond what's immediately understandable. That, I think, is here in a capacity that we've never had to deal with before. And that's what the council was trying to do, was say we have to get back to the heart of it and be practicing our faith from the inside. And I think that started really in the Middle Ages or so, with the splintering of Christian denominations, and which put ultimate power in the hands of each individual or each preacher or each person who felt that he had it right. And then it set up this kind of individualism, which over the centuries carried into the Industrial Revolution, the sexual revolution, all these things that brought us to our current state. And World War I was kind of the not the culmination of it, but that was the first time that this kind of progress was utilized on such a level that it brought such destruction and such horrors that obviously we've had full-scale war before, we've had nations go to war with each other before, but not with the technology and not with the machine guns, poison gas, tanks, all these things. These are things that we've never seen before. So I think the moral and the philosophical context backing that, and then how it's grown since then. I think that's probably some additional context that's needed. And that's something that, again, the popes of the late 19th, early 20th centuries were all writing about how the Pope Leo XIII described it as the spirit of naturalism that had penetrated everything and which prevented us from looking toward eternal things. I think that's some context that's definitely needed, and that, of course, has only gotten worse since then. It's, with the internet these days and with the way we've advanced, and I think that's a good case for why it was that we needed a council, why it was that we needed some prodding to say, we have to get back to basics here. We have to get back to our roots here and not just be going through the motions.
Thank you. Valerie.
If I may, then what does modernism have to do with everything you're speaking of here? What does modernism and a particular view of reason related to modernism have to do with this and the crisis and the proposed solution coming from traditionalist currents? Is there a tendency to throw the baby out with the bathwater with regard to modernism? Is there a tendency to not accurately define modernism where it becomes so big that everything that seems modern is a threat? That's kind of been my sense. Speak to these things.
Sure. Yeah. So I'll start by defining what modernism is not, and is what you said. It's not anything past 1965. Modernism is a very specific philosophical thought or very specific outlook, very clearly defined by Pope Pius X. But I mean, Pius X is a very, and I say this with all respect, a very long-winded fellow. His encyclicals tend to be very extensive, and Pascendi Dominici Gregis, which is the encyclical condemning modernism, is quite long. It's quite detailed. And the traditionalists will often say, cite modernism, Pascendi, and Pope Pius X condemned it, and Pascendi. If you read Pascendi, it's talking about a very specific thing, and it's not anything modern. So modernism, tying it in with the materialism or the naturalism outlook that I was talking about, is ultimately rooted in what Pius X calls in agnosticism. And I will find the quote that I talk about, that I cite here, because we have to give proper context for the whole thing. So in Pascendi, he says, quote, "Modernists place the foundation of religious philosophy in that doctrine which is usually called agnosticism. According to this teaching, human reason is confined entirely within the field of phenomena, that is to say, to things that are perceptible to the senses, and in the manner in which they are perceptible. It has no right and no power to transgress these limits. Hence, it is incapable of lifting itself up to God and of recognizing his existence, even by means of visible things," end quote. So that's ultimately the guiding force behind modernism, is agnosticism, which is that there is nothing beyond the immediately comprehensible. There's nothing truly supernatural. I mean, the two sides of modernism are agnosticism, which is what Pius X describes as the negative side, and then the positive side is immanentism, which is kind of an individual internal feeling. He calls it. He says that faith according to the modernist outlook, he says faith consists in a sentiment which originates from a need of the divine. So it's this internal need for something supernatural, which we recognize, but that's not handed down to us through divine revelation. It's just an internal feeling that would then project onto that would then project faith onto external things. So it's rooted in ultimately godlessness. That is not what the Second Vatican Council said, declared, implied. Nothing like that. That is not what the teachings of the council declared or implied or anything like that. That's a very specific outlook that is, it is in part responsible for the crisis. But what I want to ask the traditionalists is, if this crisis of modernism, which they see as the primary culprit here, if the pre-Vatican II ways, pre-Vatican II Catholicism, did not stop modernism from developing and infecting the church to such the degree that it did, why would going back to it fix it if we're in such a fix now? Why would returning to the older ways do something that it didn't prevent from happening in the first place? that doesn't seem very consistent to me. I mean, yeah, it was. I mean, it was in 19. Pascendi was 03 or 05. I forget the exact date, but like within the first couple of years of the 20th century. And already Pope Pius X was ringing the alarm bells really hard and saying, this is a huge problem. And we had, the Index of Forbidden Books, and we had the Syllabus of Errors from one of his predecessors not long before that, and all these things to clamp down on it and to say we have to, Pope Pius X kind of sniffing out modernism in the seminaries and in the universities, and that he sent out all these orders to we have to root it out and all this stuff. If we were in such a dire state at the turn of the 20th century, I just don't see it as logically consistent that just returning to how we were doing things 50 years ago, 60 years ago, is going to fix that when it's only gotten worse. That just, it's not very consistent. So the idea that we should just redact the council and redact the new missal and just scrap all that and forget that it ever happened, and that's going to fix this crisis of faith that we're in, I don't see that as a very defensible position. And that's why I think staying with the church and staying with the authority and staying with the teaching, even if they don't seem to make sense to us, or even if they don't seem to be what we would want to do, or any of these things, that's really the only way out. The way out is through. The way out is not back. So yeah, that's kind of my long-winded answer to the modernism question.
And if that makes sense,
that's we gotta have some space for Christopher, though.
You're right, but I want to get back to it. So let me. When
okay. I don't have much to say, but I think one of the things that comes out of this whole controversy we're undergoing is to guard against reaction, what my friend Thomas Stork calls the reactive mind, and that's one of the biggest problems. I read a book many years ago. It was written in the 50s. I didn't read it in the 50s. I'm not as old as Jim, but I read it.
Slam!
Jim is actually in living contact with the 1960s. He could tell you all about it. But anyway, it was called Christianity is Revolutionary. It was actually a very Orthodox Catholic book. But the basic thesis is that the church has always acted in surprising ways in order to address current crises. An example of that is the foundation of the mendicant orders in the 13th century. People don't realize that the foundation of a whole entire order like the Dominicans, which were designated as preachers, that was extremely radical at the time, because preachers were only men who were appointed such by their bishops. But the Pope actually established a whole order which could function as bishops anywhere in the church without the permission of the local ordinary. That was something which was quite unusual, or that both the mendicant orders were living in ways that some of the Albigensian heretics were living. They were basically living highly ascetical lives and going around preaching like the Albigensians did. So in other words, what the church did is it took the opportunity and recognized something which arose up within the church in order to answer the problems of the church. And that's one of the things we have to expect from the church, that sometimes there's going to be some rather surprising, unusual developments. The problem is when those unusual developments, I think, would occur in the 1960s, are not sufficiently rooted in what's in the past. They're not sufficiently rooted in the tradition. And that's where the traditionalists are pointing at, I think, and that's where they ought to be listened to. Is that you have to tie this to tradition. You have to somehow justify in the tradition, which is not just simply what we've been doing all these centuries, but it's also what the teachings of the church are. That these things, it has to be consistent with what being Catholic has always meant. And then you have to be careful of that, of course, because sometimes what we think of being Catholic has always meant is not what being Catholic has always meant. It's just some errant tradition that might have come along. But that being said, that has to be, both sides have to recognize, the traditionalists have to recognize the kind of radical nature of the church, the revolutionary nature of the church. And the revolutionaries have to recognize the founded nature of the church, that it's an organic growth. And I think those are things which will reconcile us if we actually, or at least get us close to reconciliation if we actually seriously engage them.
Thank you. Well, we end as always, with the gospel for the day. This is from Matthew. On that day, Jesus went out of the house and sat down by the sea. Such large crowds gathered around him that he got into a boat and sat down, and the whole crowd stood along the shore. And he spoke to them at length in parables, saying, The sower went out to sow, and as he sowed, some seed fell on the path, and birds came and ate it up. Some fell on rocky ground where it had little soil. It sprang up at once because the soil was not deep, and when the sun rose, it was scorched, and it withered for lack of roots. Some seed fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked it. But some seed fell on rich soil and produced fruit, 100 or 60 or 30-fold. Whoever has ears ought to hear. Come, Lord Jesus, come.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.